Aboard a Japanese aircraft carrier steaming toward a small American atoll in the middle of the Pacific, a young naval aviator writes by the dim light of his bunk, recording what his entire fleet believes will be the battle that finally destroys American naval power in the Pacific for good. Above him, on the flight deck, dozens of aircraft sit fully fueled and armed, engines silent, waiting for a second strike his commanders are certain will finish off whatever the Americans have left. Below decks, sailors move through the familiar rhythms of a warship at sea, checking ordnance, tending engines, catching what rest they can before dawn brings the next phase of an operation 8 months in the planning. He does not know that within the span of 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 proudest aircraft carriers in the Japanese Navy will be transformed into burning wreckage, and that the 4th will follow them to the bottom of the ocean before the day is finished. These files were sealed for a reason. Some, for 50 years. Tonight, they're open. What you are about to hear is drawn from the kind of diary entries recovered from Japanese naval officers who fought at Midway in June of 1942, reconstructed here to tell the story of the battle that historians still call the turning point of the entire Pacific War, from the perspective of the men who believed, right up until the moment it happened, that victory was already theirs. This is what it looked like from the deck of a carrier that did not yet know it was doomed. May 28. We depart Hashirajima with a fleet the likes of which I have never seen assembled in one place, 4 of our finest aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, screened by battleships and cruisers, sailing toward a speck of land called Midway that our planners believe will draw the American fleet into the decisive battle we have wanted since Pearl Harbor. I remember standing on the deck of this same carrier 6 months ago, watching our first strike wave return from Hawaii, pilots practically euphoric, certain they had crippled the American Pacific Fleet for a generation. 6 months ago we humiliated the Americans in Hawaii, and every officer aboard this ship speaks as though that victory settled the question of who commands the Pacific. I want to share that confidence. Most of the men around me do, completely. We have not lost a major carrier battle. Our pilots are among the most experienced in the world, veterans of years of fighting across Asia and the opening months of this war, and the aircraft we fly, though I have heard whispers that American designs are catching up faster than our intelligence services want to admit, remain formidable in the hands of pilots as skilled as the ones aboard this ship. Some of the older aviators aboard, men who flew in China years before this wider war began, speak of the Americans with a dismissiveness I find harder to share the longer this war continues, as though the enemy's industrial capacity and growing familiarity with our tactics count for nothing against the individual skill of a veteran Japanese pilot. And yet, something about the scale of this operation, the complexity of its timing, the number of separate forces that must all arrive precisely where our planners have calculated them, leaves me with a small, persistent unease I have not mentioned to anyone. War rarely follows a plan this intricate without something going wrong somewhere along the way. June 3. We are close now, and the operation has already grown stranger than I expected. Our forces have split into groups so widely separated across the Pacific that some of them will not be able to support each other if anything goes wrong at Midway itself, a decision made, I am told, to disguise our true intentions and draw American attention toward a diversionary attack in the north, against the Aleutian Islands, meant to pull American ships away from where we actually intend to strike. I trust our commanders understand risks I cannot see from where I sit, but even the most junior officers aboard this ship have begun to notice that our plan assumes almost perfect knowledge of where the American fleet is and is not, an assumption that feels increasingly fragile the longer I think about it. We believe the American aircraft carriers that survived Pearl Harbor are still recovering from damage sustained in a separate engagement weeks ago, in a sea far to the south, and that they cannot possibly arrive in time to interfere with what we intend to do at Midway. Our intelligence officers speak of this with a confidence I find difficult to fully share, given how little direct observation any of us have had of American shipyards or repair facilities in recent weeks. I hope our intelligence is as accurate as our commanders insist it is, because our entire plan depends on the Americans being somewhere else entirely when we strike. Tonight, going over the operational charts with a fellow aviator, we counted no fewer than 5 separate task forces spread across an enormous stretch of ocean, each expected to arrive at its assigned position within a narrow window of time, and neither of us could quite bring ourselves to say aloud what we were both thinking. That a plan this dependent on precise timing across such distances leaves very little room for anything to go wrong. June 4th, early morning. The attack on Midway itself has begun, and our aircraft report the atoll's defenses damaged but not destroyed, meaning a second strike against the ground targets will be necessary before our own invasion forces can safely approach. This single piece of information, delivered calmly over the radio from our strike leader, has set in motion a decision that I did not fully appreciate the significance of until hours later. Our carrier decks, which had been preparing a reserve of aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in case American ships appeared unexpectedly, are now being ordered to rearm those same aircraft with general-purpose bombs suited for a second strike against Midway's ground defenses instead. This process, changing an entire deck's worth of aircraft from one type of ordnance to another, takes considerable time, and requires our flight decks to be cluttered with fuel lines, bomb carts, and aircraft in various states of readiness, a vulnerability every officer aboard understands in the abstract but that none of us are thinking about with any real urgency, because we still believe the American fleet is nowhere near close enough to exploit it. I spoke briefly with a deck officer overseeing the rearming effort on this ship, and he described the work almost cheerfully, an ordinary, well-rehearsed procedure that Japanese carrier crews had performed dozens of times over the preceding months without incident, nothing about this particular morning suggesting to him that today's rearming would be any different from the countless others that came before it. June 4th, mid-morning. A scout aircraft has reported American ships to the northeast, and the mood on the bridge has shifted from confidence to something closer to controlled alarm. Worse, the sighting report is unclear about whether an American aircraft carrier is present among those ships, a piece of information our commander needs immediately and does not have, forcing him to choose between continuing to rearm our aircraft for a second strike on Midway or reversing the process yet again to prepare torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in case the American ships include a carrier after all. I do not envy the decision he faces, because either choice carries real risk, and there is no time to do both properly. An hour passed, by my own count, between the first ambiguous sighting report and the confirmation that finally arrived, an hour in which our commander delayed launching a strike against the newly sighted American ships in hopes of first recovering our own returning Midway strike aircraft, refueling them, and launching a single, properly coordinated attack rather than sending our forces out in a piecemeal fashion. Word passes through the ship that a carrier has indeed been confirmed among the American ships, and now our flight decks, already cluttered with the earlier rearming effort, must undergo another complete change, bombs being struck back down into the magazines, torpedoes being brought up in their place, all while American torpedo planes are already reported inbound toward our formation. I go up briefly to the flight deck to check on my own aircraft and find it a scene of barely controlled chaos, aviation fuel lines still snaking across the deck from earlier refueling operations, bombs stacked in improvised locations because the magazines cannot process the reversal fast enough, air crews working with the particular tension of men who sense, without anyone saying it aloud, that time has become the one resource we do not have enough of. A junior officer near me muttered something about how much simpler this would have been if we had simply launched a scouting flight in this direction hours earlier, before any of this became necessary, and I did not have the heart to tell him I had been thinking the exact same thing since the previous evening. June 4th, late morning, approximately 10:15. American torpedo planes have attacked our formation in the last half hour, slow, vulnerable aircraft flying low and level directly into our combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire, and I watched from the deck as nearly every one of them was destroyed before releasing a single torpedo that struck home. Squadron after squadron of these aircraft came in low over the water, seemingly without fighter escort of their own, and our Zero pilots tore into them with what I can only describe as brutal efficiency, diving from altitude to cut down one lumbering American aircraft after another before they could close to effective torpedo range. One officer aboard, watching through binoculars, remarked that an entire squadron of these torpedo bombers, flying in a formation so exposed it seemed almost suicidal, had been annihilated nearly to the last aircraft, not one of their torpedoes finding its mark against our maneuvering ships, and I remember thinking, watching those aircraft fall one after another into the sea, that whoever ordered American pilots into an attack with so little chance of survival must have understood exactly what he was asking of them. It should have felt like a victory, and for a few minutes it did, our fighters diving low to finish off the last of the torpedo planes, tracer fire crossing the water where burning American aircraft were already going down, columns of black smoke marking the graves of pilots who had flown directly into what must have looked, from their cockpits, like certain death. Some of the men on deck actually cheered as the last of these aircraft went down, congratulating each other on defenses so effective that an entire American torpedo squadron had been annihilated without inflicting a single hit on our ships. I understand now, thinking back on it, that this small victory contained the seed of our destruction, because it drew every one of our fighter aircraft down to low altitude to deal with the torpedo threat, stripping away the high-altitude protection that our carriers needed most, at the exact moment something else was approaching from a direction none of us were watching closely enough. What none of us understood in that moment was that the sacrifice of those torpedo planes, whatever it cost the Americans in men and aircraft, had bought exactly the opening their dive bombers needed, whether by design or by simple accident of timing that no one on either side could have fully planned. June 4th, approximately 10:20. I do not have adequate words for what happened next, and I suspect no diary entry from anyone aboard this fleet that day will fully capture it, because it happened too fast for the mind to properly process while it was occurring. American dive bombers, arriving from high altitude, completely unopposed because our fighters were still recovering from the torpedo plane engagement far below, appeared almost directly overhead with no warning any of us had time to act on. I heard the scream of their engines in a dive before I understood what was happening, a sound unlike anything our own dive bombers make, and by the time anyone on deck could shout a warning, the first bombs were already falling. I heard the scream of their engines in a dive before I understood what was happening, and within what men who survived it later insisted was no more than 5 or 6 minutes, 3 of our 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were transformed from the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy into burning wrecks. The bombs that struck them found decks still cluttered with the aftermath of our repeated rearming operations, fuel lines uncoiled and exposed, bombs and torpedoes stacked in places they should never have been left, and the fires that followed those initial hits spread with a speed and violence that the ship's own damage control parties, however well trained, had no realistic chance of containing. Aboard Akagi, I am told, a single bomb that struck near the elevator amidships found exactly the kind of exposed ordnance and fuel that turned one explosion into a chain of secondary detonations tearing through the ship's hangar deck within moments. Word later reached the surviving ships that our fleet commander, Admiral Nagumo, had been standing on Akagi's own bridge when the American dive bombers arrived, watching his flagship burn beneath him, forced eventually to abandon the ship along with his staff and transfer his command to a cruiser as Akagi became unsalvageable, a personal humiliation for a man who had commanded the very strike force that devastated Pearl Harbor barely 6 months earlier, now reduced to watching his own flagship consumed by the same kind of fire his aircraft had once inflicted on the Americans in Hawaii. I watched Kaga from a distance, and what I remember most clearly, more than the explosions themselves, is how quickly the black smoke rising from her flight deck seemed to consume the entire silhouette of a ship that, an hour earlier, had seemed as permanent and unshakable as anything in this war. Men who had been standing on Kaga's deck moments before were now visible only as small figures leaping into the water well clear of the ship, and the sound reaching us across the water, even from this distance, was unlike anything I have heard in this war, secondary explosions continuing to rip through her hull long after the American dive bombers themselves had already departed the scene, their work finished in less time than it takes to eat a meal. June 4th, afternoon. Only Hiryu remains of our 4 carriers, and her aircraft have launched a furious counterattack against the American carrier responsible for what happened to our fleet this morning, a ship we now know is called Yorktown. Our pilots, veterans who have flown together for years, struck her hard, and reports reaching Hiryu suggest she has been left burning and dead in the water, a small measure of vengeance for what was lost this morning. Word spread across what remained of our fleet that Hiryu's air crews had pressed home their attack against Yorktown with a ferocity that reflected exactly what all of us were feeling that afternoon, men who had watched 3 sister ships burn that morning now determined to make the Americans pay in kind, launching strike after strike even as their own numbers dwindled with each sortie. For a few hours, there was something almost like hope aboard this last surviving carrier, a sense that even after the catastrophe of the morning, we might yet salvage something from this day, that Hiryu alone might yet prove sufficient to turn the battle back in our favor if she could just survive long enough to strike again. That hope did not survive the afternoon. American dive bombers found Hiryu in turn, striking her with the same devastating precision that had destroyed her three sister ships hours earlier, and by evening she too is burning beyond any hope of saving, her captain reportedly choosing to remain aboard as she is finally scuttled rather than survive the loss of his ship. Sailors who abandoned Hiryu before she went down described her captain standing calmly on the bridge as the order to abandon ship was given, refusing every entreaty to leave with his men, a final image that some of the surviving crew have already begun speaking of in the hushed, reverent tones usually reserved for stories told about ancestors rather than events from earlier that same day. By nightfall, the fleet that departed Hashirajima 8 days ago with 4 of the finest aircraft carriers in the world now has none, and the officers still capable of speaking about what happened today do so in the careful, hollow tones of men still trying to understand how a battle we were so certain of winning became, in the space of a single morning, the worst defeat the Imperial Japanese Navy has ever suffered. June 5. We are withdrawing now, what remains of this fleet, carrying with us thousands of sailors and airmen who will never see their families again, and a silence aboard every surviving ship that feels heavier than any storm I have sailed through in this war. The wounded fill every available space below decks on the escorting cruisers and destroyers that took aboard survivors from our burning carriers, men with burns I do not have adequate words to describe, and doctors working past the point of exhaustion trying to save as many as they can with supplies never intended to treat casualties on this scale. I keep returning, in my thoughts, to the decision to rearm our aircraft not once but twice in the space of a single morning, a decision that made perfect sense at each individual moment it was made, and that in combination left our flight decks catastrophically vulnerable at the exact instant American dive bombers arrived overhead. I do not know if a different decision at any single point that morning would have changed what happened. I suspect no one aboard this fleet will ever know for certain. What I do know is that we sailed toward Midway believing the American fleet could not possibly be where it turned out to be, prepared and waiting for us with knowledge of our plans that, looking back now, feels almost impossible for them to have obtained through ordinary means. I do not understand how they knew where and when to find us. I only know that they did, and that 4 carriers and the men who could not escape them in time paid the price for whatever allowed the Americans to be exactly where they needed to be on the one morning that mattered most. Tonight, standing on the deck of the cruiser that picked up my own aircraft's crew after Hiryu went down, I found myself unable to stop looking back toward the empty horizon where 4 carriers had steamed alongside us just 24 hours earlier, unable to fully accept that ships I had considered as permanent a feature of this war as the ocean itself were now simply gone, resting somewhere on the floor of the Pacific with hundreds of men who will have no grave anyone will ever be able to visit. That diary entry, like others recovered from Japanese naval officers who survived Midway, captures a defeat whose true cause remained hidden from the men who lived through it. What the aviator writing those entries did not know, and what Japanese Naval Command would not fully understand for years afterward, was that American codebreakers, working in a cramped basement office in Hawaii under a naval intelligence officer named Joseph Rockefort, had partially broken Japan's naval communication codes in the months before the battle, allowing the United States Navy to determine not only that an attack on Midway was coming, but approximately when and from which direction. Rockefort's team had gone so far as to confirm the target of the coming attack through a deliberate ruse, arranging for Midway's garrison to transmit a fake message reporting a freshwater shortage in an easily broken code, then watching for the Japanese to reference that same detail in their own encrypted communications. A confirmation that let Admiral Chester Nimitz position American aircraft carriers exactly where they needed to be to ambush a Japanese fleet that believed itself to be striking first with the element of surprise fully intact. The 5 to 6 minutes in which American dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, catching Japanese flight decks in the exact vulnerable state described in that diary entry, decks cluttered with fuel and ordnance from repeated rearming operations, remain one of the single most consequential windows of time in the entire Pacific War. Historians studying the battle afterward have noted the specific, almost improbable convergence of factors that produced that outcome: American intelligence identifying the target and timing in advance, Japanese scouting failing to detect the American carriers until it was too late, the American torpedo squadrons that were nearly annihilated but that succeeded in drawing Japanese fighter cover down to sea level at the critical moment, and the accident of timing that placed American dive bombers directly over 3 Japanese carriers at the precise instant their decks were most exposed. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, roughly 300 aircraft, and, most irreplaceably, hundreds of experienced naval aviators and deck crew whose skill could not be quickly reproduced by wartime training programs, a loss in trained personnel that historians consider even more damaging to Japan's long-term ability to wage the war than the ships themselves, since Japan's flight training pipeline, unlike America's, was never restructured to produce replacement pilots at anything close to the rate its front-line squadrons were losing them. The United States, by contrast, lost a single carrier, Yorktown, already damaged from an earlier battle weeks before, along with roughly 150 aircraft, an exchange rate so lopsided that Midway is now taught in military academies as one of the clearest examples in naval history of how intelligence, timing, and a narrow window of vulnerability can outweigh a numerical and experience advantage that, on paper, should have made the outcome of the battle look entirely different. The battle marked the last time during the Second World War that the Imperial Japanese Navy would hold a numerical advantage in aircraft carriers over the United States Navy in the Pacific, a strategic reality that historians studying the war's broader arc have identified as the true significance of what happened in those few minutes off Midway Atoll. American shipyards, operating at a wartime production capacity that Japan's more limited industrial base could not begin to match, would go on to build new aircraft carriers faster than Japan could replace even a fraction of what was lost that June morning, launching new fleet and light carriers at a pace that, within roughly 2 years, would give the United States Navy a numerical advantage in the Pacific so overwhelming that Japan's surviving carrier force could no longer be risked in a major fleet engagement without near certain destruction. This shift, contested and uncertain in the war's opening 6 months, when Japanese naval aviators genuinely could claim rough parity or even an edge in individual pilot skill and aircraft performance, became decisive and permanent in the aftermath of a battle that had been intended, by the Japanese command that planned it, to accomplish exactly the opposite outcome: to cripple American naval power in the Pacific so thoroughly that the United States would be forced to sue for a negotiated peace, rather than continue an increasingly costly war. The 4 carriers that vanished in roughly 5 minutes off Midway did not simply cost Japan 4 ships. They cost Japan the initiative in the Pacific War, an initiative the country would never fully recover for the remainder of the conflict, and set in motion the long, grinding American advance across the Pacific, island by island, that would eventually bring the war to Japan's own shores 3 years later. So, what do you think? Was Midway the true turning point of the entire Pacific War, or do you know another battle that deserves that title? It's worth sitting with just how narrow the margin actually was that morning, 5 or 6 minutes separating overwhelming Japanese naval superiority from a defeat so severe that Japan would spend the rest of the war fighting a defensive campaign it had never planned or trained for, a reminder that even the largest, most confident military forces can find the entire course of a war decided in less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud. Let me know in the comments below, and if stories like this one, real battles seen through the eyes of the men who fought them, including the ones on the losing side of history, are the kind of thing you want more of. Make sure to subscribe to A Veteran Tale, leave a like, and turn on notifications, because there are a lot more stories like this one waiting to be told.